Welcome to The Last Hike. Today we're going to uncover the El Capitan climb, where one Netflix movie convinced a woman that she could do what its fictional climber did.
Arrogance and the belief that years of climbing experience were nothing more than gatekeeping convinced her she could climb El Capitan with nothing but a brand new pair of climbing shoes. Knowing how this story ends, it's chilling how avoidable it all was. It was June 12, 2021, a Saturday morning in Yosemite Valley, California, where clear skies, cool early temperatures, and calm winds created conditions that appeared nearly ideal for a summer day beneath the granite walls of El Capitan. Amarian Perilous was 34 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator for a wellness company in Sacramento, California. She lived alone, had a steady office job, and spent most of her free time focused on fitness.
That's just a normal person's life. A good one, honestly.
During the week, her routine was pretty consistent. Work, the gym, then sharing her progress on social media. On weekends, she'd usually head out to hike the maintained trails around Northern California. The people who knew her described her as disciplined, ambitious, and always looking for ways to challenge herself. That was a big part of her identity. Her posts often talked about pushing past your limits and believing that personal growth came from doing things that felt difficult. By every measure, she was a healthy and experienced recreational hiker. But there was one important thing she wasn't. Amarian wasn't a technical climber. There was no record of her doing indoor climbing, outdoor rock climbing, bouldering, or any kind of rope descent. Aside from the occasional Class 3 hike, she had no documented experience on steep granite, using climbing gear, or navigating terrain where one mistake could quickly become impossible to recover from.
Not even a bouldering gym. Nothing.
Yet in just a matter of weeks, one Netflix movie completely changed the way she saw climbing. But in the weeks leading up to June 12th, something started to change. Amarian had been watching a newly released Netflix movie about a fictional big wall climber, and she didn't just watch it once. She watched it over and over for several days, and the more she watched it, the more convinced she became that climbing wasn't nearly as difficult as people claimed. She wasn't just entertained by it, she began treating it like proof. Every time the fictional climber overcame another obstacle through determination alone, it reinforced what she already wanted to believe, that people made climbing sound far more difficult than it really was. Instead of seeing a scripted story built around dramatic moments, she saw confirmation that confidence could overcome obstacles people insisted required years of training. The more she watched, the less climbing looked like a technical discipline, and the more it looked like a test of mindset. Before long, she started posting about it online. She argued that the climbing community made the sport sound harder than it really was, mostly to keep other people out. Experienced climbers, in her view, had built an image of climbing as something only a select few could do. The more people warned about danger, the more convinced she became that those warnings were protecting an exclusive community rather than protecting inexperienced people. To her, all the ropes, gear, years of training, and climbing classes felt like gatekeeping more than actual safety measures.
I can see how that framing starts to simplify something that's actually built on layers of hard-earned experience.
She genuinely believed the biggest difference between experienced climbers and everyone else wasn't years of training. It was simply having the confidence to try. And she wasn't about to let a bunch of experts tell her otherwise. That belief developed during a period of personal frustration. Amarian had recently received a difficult professional performance review, which she believed reflected institutional bias rather than her actual abilities. Clearly a personal attack from someone who just didn't understand her unique talents. The fictional story's central theme that determination alone could overcome an establishment that underestimated capable people became personally meaningful to her.
I'm not mocking that connection, but it was a fictional character on fictional rock.
She told several acquaintances that she intended to travel to Yosemite that weekend to accomplish something significant, though she did not explain that she intended to climb El Capitan without ropes or climbing experience because, frankly, it was nobody's business but her own. 6 days before the trip, she purchased a pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes through an online retailer after comparing her street shoe size with an online fitting guide. No other climbing equipment was purchased or documented.
One pair of shoes. That was enough because, in her mind, the shoes represented the only piece she believed she'd be missing.
Everything else, years of practice, instruction, and technical systems she'd already convinced herself, were obstacles invented by other climbers rather than necessities. The environmental conditions on the morning of June 12th offered little indication of danger to a visitor unfamiliar with technical climbing. At 7 o'clock, the temperature on the valley floor measured 61 degrees Fahrenheit beneath a cloudless sky, with a light southwest wind of approximately 4 miles per hour. Forecasts called for afternoon highs, near 84 degrees, with low humidity and no precipitation. From the meadows below, El Capitan appeared sharply illuminated in the morning sun, while its lower granite slabs rose gradually enough to resemble steep hiking terrain rather than the beginning of one of the most technically demanding climbing objectives in North America.
I've stood in that meadow. It genuinely looks manageable from down there.
But that first impression can be really misleading. Getting onto the wall actually isn't that difficult. The loose rocks at the base are easy enough to cross, and the lower granite slabs can even be walked on in regular shoes. At first, it can feel like the climb is completely manageable. The problem is that it doesn't stay that way for long. Within about the first 100 feet, the angle changes dramatically.
I'm looking at that transition point, and it's almost abrupt how the terrain just stops behaving like the start.
What started as something you could walk across quickly turns into steep, exposed rock, where every move takes real climbing skills that usually come from years of experience. Yosemite rescue teams know this all too well. Just because someone makes it through the first part of the wall doesn't mean they're prepared for what comes next. The favorable weather at sunrise could also be misleading. Experienced climbing parties often begin early to take advantage of the cooler morning hours, knowing that the south-facing granite will spend the day absorbing direct sunlight. By early afternoon, the rock surface can become far hotter than the surrounding air, while the wall offers almost no shade, no accessible water, and few places to rest. Heat, dehydration, and fatigue steadily compound every decision to continue upward. The climbing itself changes just as quickly as the environment. Broad friction slabs give way to smaller edges and isolated footholds where progress depends on precise foot placement, balance, and body positioning rather than strength alone. Specialized climbing shoes help only when paired with the experience to interpret how the rubber grips the rock. Amarian's shoes had been purchased only days earlier and had never been used on granite, leaving her without the familiarity or technical skill that experienced climbers rely upon to move safely. The part of the wall Amarian was heading toward has caught people off guard before. From the ground, it actually looks like the climb gets easier for a while before becoming steep again farther up. For someone without climbing experience, that can be enough to keep moving higher, thinking the hard part is over.
I can see how that visual illusion would be enough to push someone just a little further without questioning it.
But that's the trap. By the time the wall makes it obvious you're in over your head, getting back down is often harder than going up. And without ropes, anchors, or someone climbing with you, every extra foot off the ground leaves you with fewer and fewer safe options. Amarian arrived at the El Capitan Meadow pullout early that morning after driving from a budget motel in El Portal, about 8 miles west of Yosemite Valley, where she'd spent the night. She was wearing athletic clothes and carrying a small hydration pack with about 32 ounces of water, a protein bar, and a brand new pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes she'd bought just a few days earlier. Sitting on a boulder near the parking area, she took off her trail runners and put on the climbing shoes. Before leaving the meadow, she stopped to take a few photos with El Capitan behind her, its southeast face already lit up by the morning sun. Those pictures, later recovered from her phone, would help investigators pinpoint where she was just before she walked toward the wall.
She looked excited in those photos. You can see it.
She then followed the informal use trail leading from the meadow toward the talus field beneath the southeast face. The route winds through open forest before climbing over large, uneven boulders that require careful footing and occasional use of the hands for balance. Along the way, she passed 2 photographers positioned near the trail to photograph climbers on El Capitan. Neither recalled anything unusual about her appearance or behavior.
I think about those 2 guys a lot. They had no way of knowing.
A person in athletic clothing carrying a small day pack toward the wall on a summer morning was not by itself remarkable. After roughly 40 minutes of hiking and scrambling across the talus, Amarian reached the base of the granite wall, where the gradual lower slabs marked the beginning of the terrain she intended to climb. At the base of El Capitan, a team of 3 experienced climbers from the San Francisco Bay Area was already preparing for a multi-day ascent of the nose route. As they organized ropes and climbing hardware, one member noticed Amarian studying the wall. What immediately stood out was what she was not carrying. She wore no harness or helmet, carried no rope or climbing rack, and her climbing shoes appeared brand new. Her small hydration pack looked more appropriate for a day hike than a technical climb. One of the climbers grew concerned and walked over to ask if she was meeting a partner or a guide.
That climber had every reason to just get on with his own day.
Amarian just scoffed and said she was climbing alone, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The climber tried to explain that once she got past the lower slabs, the wall became extremely dangerous without ropes or technical climbing experience, but she barely seemed interested. She waved the warning off and pointed to a recently released Netflix climbing movie, saying it had convinced her the sport wasn't nearly as difficult as climbers claimed. Seeing climbing as gatekeeping gave her an explanation that protected her confidence. If experienced climbers were exaggerating the danger to keep ordinary people out, then every warning became evidence that she was right. Their concern no longer sounded like concern at all. To her, it sounded like experienced climbers trying to defend an image that only people like them belonged on walls like El Capitan. Her lack of experience wasn't something to worry about. It became proof that she wasn't trapped by the same limiting beliefs they were. The conversation became increasingly tense as the climber, clearly not getting the message, continued urging her to reconsider. Amarian interpreted the warnings as a personal affront and an attempt to keep her off the wall, accusing the group of protecting their status within the climbing community. She then threatened to report them to park rangers for harassment and discrimination, demanding to speak to their manager.
I genuinely don't know what to do with that reaction. They walked over to help her.
With that, she ended the discussion, turned toward the granite, and began climbing, confident that she knew best. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, one member of the climbing party immediately contacted Yosemite Dispatch to report an unroped climber attempting El Capitan without visible safety equipment or technical gear. Rangers were notified, but the report also marked the beginning of a difficult reality. By the time help could be organized, Amarian was already moving higher above the ground. The first section of the wall consisted of low-angle friction slabs, steep enough to demand careful movement but shallow enough that upward progress remained possible without technical climbing, at least initially. Amarian kept her body close to the granite, occasionally placing both palms against the rock for balance as she tested each foothold before committing her weight. Her pace was slow and deliberate, but she continued gaining elevation. The climbers at the base watched in growing concern. Nearby photographers, noticing the activity below, redirected their cameras toward the lower face. Images taken during this period show Amarian moving cautiously across the pale granite, pausing frequently as the angle gradually increased.
I can picture those pauses standing out more clearly in the photos than they probably felt in the moment.
Her new climbing shoes provided grip, but not the experience needed to use them effectively. Having never been broken in or tested on rock, they offered little of the familiarity and tactile feedback experienced climbers rely upon to judge friction and adjust their balance. On the lower slabs, where the angle remained relatively forgiving, that limitation was enough to slow her progress but not stop it.
If it were me, I'd probably still be moving too, just because nothing has forced me to stop yet.
Within the first hour of the climb, Amarian had worked her way to roughly 90 feet above the talus, well beyond the point where simply stepping back down would remain straightforward. The higher Amarian climbed, the more the wall began to change. What had started as broad granite slabs slowly disappeared, replaced by much steeper rock. Now every step had to land on tiny edges, and every move had to be just right. It wasn't something you could simply power through anymore. It took balance, precision, and experience. She was also starting to tire, and those brand new climbing shoes still weren't something she was used to. She slipped twice.
2 slips above 100 feet without a rope. My stomach dropped just reading that.
Neither time turned into a fall, but they were close calls. Ironically, surviving those slips may have reinforced the belief that she'd been right all along. She had made mistakes that should have convinced her to turn around, yet she was still on the wall. Instead of reading those moments as warnings, it would have been easy to see them as proof that she could keep handling whatever came next. She caught herself by throwing both hands against the granite and scrambling to get her feet back underneath her. The rough rock scraped up her palms, injuries that would later show up in photos taken from the valley below. Even then, she didn't stop. Every foot she climbed made the decision harder to reverse. Turning back no longer meant simply climbing down, it meant undoing every difficult move she'd already struggled through. Without ropes or any real climbing experience, retreat may have felt even more dangerous than continuing. Continuing felt dangerous. Retreating felt impossible, so she kept going.
The logic makes a terrible kind of sense. Both directions felt dangerous, so she picked up.
About 230 feet above the base of the wall, she finally reached a spot where she couldn't just keep climbing. The route straight ahead suddenly looked much steeper, with almost nowhere obvious to grab onto. She stood on a ledge only a few inches wide, facing the wall with both hands pressed against the granite. She paused. For a few seconds, it looked like she was thinking about crossing to the right, but then she changed her mind. Instead, she started moving upward and slightly to the left, onto even steeper rock. Above roughly 230 feet, Amarian entered a section of the southeast face that experienced climbers generally avoid.
In my view, when a section has that kind of reputation, it's usually because it doesn't give you any margin for hesitation.
The granite became steeper, more broken, and offered fewer reliable features for hands and feet. Unlike the standard climbing routes nearby, this section provided almost no usable ledges where a climber could stand comfortably and rest. every movement required continuous balance, muscle engagement, and concentration. Her pace slowed dramatically. Over the next 45 minutes, she gained only about 180 feet, pausing repeatedly to study the rock before each move. Photographs taken from the valley floor during this period consistently show her pressed close against the granite with both hands and both feet in contact with the wall. As the morning progressed, the southeast face became fully exposed to the sun. The granite warmed, the light wind offered little relief, and the growing height beneath her made every movement increasingly consequential. By then, Amarian was more than 400 feet above the talus with no simple route back to the ground. After getting the earlier report, park rangers made their way to the base of the wall and spotted Amarian high above them. They immediately called for a technical rescue team. But a rescue on El Capitan isn't something that can happen in a matter of minutes. Even if rescuers had reached the top immediately, they still couldn't simply pull her to safety. They first had to build anchors, rig hundreds of feet of rope, and descend to wherever she happened to be. Every minute mattered, but the rescue could only work if she stayed where she was. From the ground, the rangers kept calling up to Amarian, telling her to stay exactly where she was and wait for the rescue team. They repeated the instructions several times.
They're shouting up 400 feet of open granite. I keep thinking about how small those voices must have sounded.
But she didn't stay put. Whether she believed she could still climb out on her own or simply didn't think the situation was as serious as everyone else did, she kept trying to move. For more than an hour though, she remained almost exactly where she was, about 410 feet above the talus. Photos taken from the valley floor show only small changes in her position. Most of the time, she stayed pressed against the granite, unable to make any real progress either up or down. By then, she had exhausted the 32 ounces of water she had brought with her.
32 ounces in full sun on hot granite in June.
The southeast face was fully exposed to the late morning sun, leaving her on hot granite without shade, without water, and without any practical place to rest. She remained more than 400 feet above the talus without water, climbing equipment, or any practical route down. Rangers continued calling for her to remain where she was, while the technical rescue team worked into position above, but no one could reach her from the ground. Photographs from this period show her almost motionless against the granite, likely stewing over the incompetence of the park staff for not getting to her sooner. Shortly before noon, Amarian began climbing again. Rather than attempting to descend, as any reasonable person would, she continued upward, moving cautiously across increasingly steep granite, convinced that she knew better than the rangers below. Over the next 20 minutes, Amarian somehow climbed another 60 feet, but by now, the wall had changed completely. It was almost vertical, and every move depended on tiny edges, thin cracks in the granite, and small footholds that were easy to miss. She couldn't see the next move before making the last one. She had to shift her weight first, then search for somewhere, anywhere to place a hand or a foot.
Somehow, she kept going. I'm not going to pretend I don't feel how tight that progression is getting just hearing it described.
By the time she reached roughly 470 feet above the talus, though, she had nowhere left to go. The granite above her offered no obvious holds. She was standing on a strip of rock only a few inches wide, with both palms pressed flat against the wall just to stay balanced. She wasn't holding on to anything anymore. She was simply trying to stay on the wall.
There's no movement left in this posture, only effort to not slip.
Later, after reviewing photographs taken from the valley floor, a climbing consultant concluded that she'd reached a position where there was no practical way to continue without technical climbing equipment. Shortly after noon on June 12th, Amarian Varelis fell from the southeast face of El Capitan. Investigators later estimated she fell from somewhere between 460 and 480 feet above the talus below. The fall was witnessed by two park rangers, a member of the climbing party who had spoken with her earlier that morning, and a photographer documenting the incident from the valley floor. The photographer's camera captured the fall in a sequence of images that was later submitted to investigators as part of the official review. The photographic sequence is consistent with an initial foot slip followed almost immediately by the loss of both hand contacts. There is no indication of a prolonged slide or an attempt to regain control after the initial loss of balance. She separated from the wall and entered freefall.
I'm not going to add anything here. I'll just let that sit.
Investigators determined that her trajectory carried her away from the granite before striking the wall lower down, followed by a final impact on the talus field below. The entire fall lasted only a matter of seconds. Park rangers reached her within minutes, with emergency medical personnel arriving shortly afterward. Amarian was pronounced dead at the scene. Following the incident, Yosemite's technical rescue team secured the base of El Capitan, while investigators began standard documentation of the scene. Witness statements were collected from the climbing party that had spoken with Amarian before she started climbing, the park rangers who monitored the incident from below, the meadow photographer who documented much of the ascent, and other visitors who had observed portions of the event. The photographer voluntarily provided the complete sequence of images captured throughout the morning, allowing investigators to reconstruct Amarian's Amarian's movements on the wall with unusual precision. Dispatch logs also confirmed that concerns about an unroped climber had been reported hours before the fall, and that a technical rescue response had already been initiated, though the complexity of organizing a high-angle rescue on El Capitan prevented rescuers from reaching her position before the incident occurred. The Regional Medical Examiner's Office conducted a full post-mortem examination. The findings documented multiple catastrophic blunt force injuries involving the head, spine, chest, pelvis, and internal organs, consistent with a high-altitude fall involving secondary impact with the granite wall before the final impact on the talus below. Toxicology testing detected no alcohol, prescription medications, or illicit substances that would have impaired judgment or coordination.
Not that it changes anything, but it gets asked in every case, so it gets answered.
The manner of death was certified as accidental, and the cause of death was listed as multiple blunt force injuries sustained during an unroped fall from El Capitan. The investigative review found no evidence of rockfall, unstable terrain beyond the normal conditions of the route, equipment malfunction, criminal conduct, or third-party involvement. Instead, investigators concluded that the incident resulted from an attempt to climb technical granite terrain without the specialized skills, protective equipment, or climbing systems required for that environment. The review further noted that Amarian had continued into progressively steeper sections of the wall after repeated opportunities to turn back and despite direct warnings from experienced climbers before leaving the ground. No criminal charges or civil enforcement actions were taken, and park officials issued only a routine public notice confirming a fatal climbing incident within Yosemite Valley.